wind carried the taste of grit and old heat, the kind that clung to skin and refused to let go. As the drifter came down from the canyon ridge, the dying sun bled across the desert horizon in streaks of copper and crimson, washing the world in a glow that seemed half fire, half farewell. His horse, lean and dust-coated, plodded along the narrow trail with the rhythm of something that had walked 100 miles too many. The man on its back sat straight, his frame wiry but unbent by time, his coat frayed at the edges from wind and wear. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, though even in shadow there was something in them that unsettled, an iron stillness that told of storms endured. The town appeared almost by accident, nestled at the edge of a dry creek bed where cottonwoods tried their best to look alive. Weather-beaten shacks leaned into one another as if afraid to collapse alone, and the saloon's lantern was the only thing burning bright against the dusk. Chickens scattered as the drifter's horse clopped down the main street, and two boys with patched trousers stopped mid-game, staring wide-eyed. The stranger's arrival was like the sudden sweep of a hawk's shadow, small, fleeting, yet enough to hush laughter and draw whispers. No one knew his name. Some said he came from the border. Others swore he was seen once riding north from Apache land, and a few whispered he was a ghost of some long-buried feud. Whatever the tale, it stuck to him like dust to his boots. He dismounted without a word, boots crunching on the hard-packed earth, and tied his horse to the post outside the saloon. A scar ran jagged across his left hand, old and white, catching the last light of the evening like a cruel reminder carved into flesh. His revolver rested low on his hip, worn smooth at the grip, as if his hand and the weapon were long acquainted. Inside, the saloon swelled with the stench of whiskey and sweat. A piano tried to push a lively tune through sticky keys, and men hunched over their cards with the kind of focus that came only from desperation. The stranger walked in, every eye flickering toward him before sliding back to their games. He didn't speak, just moved to the bar and set a silver coin down with a hollow clink. The barkeep, a man with shoulders as wide as barrels and eyes that had seen better years, studied him for a moment before pouring the whiskey. The stranger drank slow, savoring the burn as if it were less about the taste and more about the silence it gave him. Behind his stillness was a weight, like a man carrying a burden no one else could see. People in the corner whispered about the scar, about the steady way he looked at nothing in particular, about the quiet gravity that seemed to hang around him like smoke. The barkeep, polishing the same glass he'd been holding too long, muttered to a regular, "A man don't look like that, less he's done things he don't care to speak on." When he turned toward the room, conversations faltered. His eyes, deep set beneath the hat, caught fragments of faces and lingered on none. Yet everyone felt seen. There was no arrogance in it, no challenge. Just a quiet reminder that he noticed, and that was enough to leave men shifting uncomfortably on their stools. A woman in a faded calico dress carried drinks between tables, her gaze brushing over him only once before darting away. Even that brief glance carried unease, as if she'd recognized something dangerous, or perhaps familiar in him. He didn't linger long. The whiskey gone, he stepped back into the evening air, where the sky had turned violet and shadows stretched long across the ground. The townsfolk outside watched from porches and doorways, curious and cautious. Children whispered to one another, "Who is he?" while their mothers pulled them back into the safety of their homes. The stranger untied his horse and stood for a moment, breathing in the dry wind that whistled through warped shutters and cracked signs. He seemed a man listening not to the world around him, but to echoes carried within. At the blacksmith's, a hammer rang against iron, sharp and steady. The stranger's gaze lingered on the sparks, on the rhythm of work that spoke of permanence and belonging, things he hadn't carried with him in years. The sound tugged at something inside him, a memory perhaps, though his face revealed nothing. He mounted his horse again, moving toward the edge of town, and yet he paused near the general store, where two old men sat on a bench. They fell silent under his look, but when he had passed, one of them whispered, "That man's been places. You can tell by the way he don't flinch." Night settled fast on the frontier, stars scattering bright and cold above the desert. The stranger found himself at the edge of a dry arroyo, tethering his horse beneath a mesquite tree. He built no fire, though the chill pressed close. Instead, he sat with his back against the trunk, revolver resting on his knee, as if he knew better than to trust the darkness. His eyes lifted toward the stars, though his thoughts were far away, wrapped in places where firelight once danced over faces long gone. Every scar on his body seemed to whisper a story, yet none would be told aloud. Back in town, the whispers grew louder. By lantern light, men speculated in hushed tones. He's running from something. No, he's hunting someone. That hand seen blood. I'd bet my last dollar. The more they spoke, the less they knew, and the mystery only thickened. Children lay awake in bed, imagining the stranger as outlaw, as lawman, as avenger. In the saloon, the woman in calico stared at the empty chair he had left, unsettled by the calm that clung to him like a shadow. The desert night stretched on, silent except for the cry of a coyote in the distance. The drifter sat unmoving, a figure carved out of patience and solitude. If sleep came, it did so lightly, one hand never straying far from the revolver at his side. He knew the land, knew the way danger moved across it like wind over sand, sudden and merciless. His presence in town had not gone unnoticed. He felt the weight of eyes on him, the shift in the air that warned of trouble stirring beneath the surface. Yet he waited, as if waiting were what he had been born to do. When the first light of dawn stretched thin gold across the horizon, he was already in the saddle, riding back toward town with the ease of a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. His shadow stretched long behind him, trailing across the dust like a ghost unwilling to let go. The people of the town would soon see him again, and the story would begin to write itself, the kind of story whispered in saloons and told around campfires long after the smoke had drifted away. The stranger rode on, each hoofbeat a steady drum of inevitability, and though no one yet knew it, his arrival was not chance. It was the beginning of something that would stain the desert with memory and mark the town forever. The dying sun of yesterday had brought him in, but it would be fire and steel that decided what his presence truly meant. The morning broke hard and bright, with the desert sun pouring over the town like molten brass. Dust already stirred on the horizon before the heat had settled, a plume rising from the trail that wound down from the hills. By the time the riders appeared, every shutter in the main street had closed, every door bolted, every woman ushering children inside with a trembling hand on their shoulders. Folks here had learned the signs too well. Pike Durgan and his gang had come calling again. They came like a storm without mercy. 8 men astride lean, sweat-darkened horses, their coats flapping, rifles slung across their shoulders. At their head rode Pike himself, a broad figure with a scarred jaw and eyes that had the gleam of a man who enjoyed cruelty. He reined in before the saloon. A wolfish grin spread across his face and spat into the dust. "Mornin', folks," he bellowed, though not a single soul dared answer. The silence suited him just fine. 2 of his men dragged a wagon from the general store, splintering its wheels against the post, tossing sacks of flour and beans into the street, as if mocking the town's hunger. One struck a match and touched it to the wagon bed. Flames caught fast in the dry wood, snapping and snarling until black smoke curled into the sky. The crackle of fire was louder than the prayers whispered behind closed curtains. At the blacksmith's, the hammer fell silent when a bandit shoved the man aside, demanding coin he didn't have. The smith's daughter clung to her father's arm, her face pale beneath streaks of soot. The outlaw yanked the necklace from her neck, laughing as if her fear were the sweetest wine. Pike, watching from atop his horse, only smiled. On the edge of town, a farmer's cart had just rattled in from the trail, carrying a load of potatoes. The bandits turned on him like vultures. They tipped the cart, spilling his harvest into the dirt, stomping it beneath their boots until the ground was smeared with ruined food. The farmer pleaded, voice breaking, but Pike silenced him with a backhand across the face, the blow sending him sprawling in the dust. Laughter followed, sharp and cruel, ringing in the air long after the farmer's groan had faded. From the porch of the saloon, the drifter watched. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but the set of his jaw betrayed a hardness that no one noticed in the chaos. He leaned against a post, the faint scar on his hand catching the light as he drew a match to his cigarette. Smoke curled from his lips as he studied the gang, not flinching when the wagon burst fully into flame. To the townsfolk peering through cracks in their doors, his stillness was strange, unnerving. A man watching hell unfold without stepping forward seemed as dangerous as the devils who'd lit the fire. Pike's men swaggered into the saloon, overturning chairs, demanding whiskey they didn't pay for. One of them shoved the piano man's head down over his eyes, jeering as the old fellow fumbled. Another grabbed at the barmaid's arm, pulling her close until Pike barked at him to quit. "We're here for coin, not sport." Even his restraint was cruel, a reminder that indulgence was his choice alone. The drifter remained where he stood. When Pike's gaze swept the street, his eyes fell briefly on the stranger. For a long moment, silence stretched taut between them. Pike's grin twitched at the corners, as if he weighed whether the shadowed figure before him was worth noticing. Then he snorted, dismissing him with a shake of his head, and turned his horse toward the blacksmith's forge. Yet the drifter did not look away, and those who saw it swore later that Pike's dismissal had been more forced than genuine. As the bandits rode off, their saddlebags stuffed with stolen coin and supplies, the town exhaled as though waking from a nightmare. People drifted out of hiding, eyes on the smoke rising from a wagon, the ruined food, the tears streaking the blacksmith's daughter's face. They looked toward the saloon porch, toward the man who had stood unmoving through it all. Some saw cowardice, others saw caution. A few, though, whispered of something colder, that maybe he was one of them, biding his time, watching for opportunity. In the saloon that night, with nerves still frayed and whiskey flowing freely, the talk circled back to him. "He don't scare easy," muttered one man, eyes darting toward the corner where the drifter sat alone with his glass. "Maybe too easy with the sight of blood and fire." Another leaned in, lowering his voice. "Could be bounty hunter. Could be worse. I've seen the way he carries that Colt. That ain't no man's trinket. It's a tool sharpened by years." The barkeep shook his head slowly. "He's a man with ghosts, that much is plain. But ghosts don't draw faster than the living unless they've got reason." No one dared ask him. He sat in silence, a figure carved from shadow and memory, the smoke of the saloon wrapping around him like old sins. He listened without appearing to, and every word only added to the shroud of mystery. The barmaid caught his eye once as she passed with a tray of drinks, her expression uncertain, caught between gratitude that he hadn't joined Pike's men and suspicion that his stillness meant something darker. Outside, the desert wind rattled the shutters, carrying the smell of charred wood through the town. Families gathered at tables, speaking in hushed tones about what had been lost and what might come next. The children, wide-eyed, asked why the stranger hadn't helped, and their mothers had no answer. Some said he feared Pike's wrath, others that he was too clever to get tangled in another man's fight. But one boy, braver than the rest, whispered, "Maybe he's waiting. Maybe he's got his own reason." His father hushed him, though his own eyes flicked toward the saloon with the same thought gnawing at the edges. Night deepened, and the town settled uneasily into silence, but the sense of dread lingered like smoke after a blaze. Pike Durgan's men would come again, everyone knew it. The question was not if, but when, and whether the town would survive the next storm. In that uneasy quiet, the drifter remained alone at his table, the lamplight glinting off the revolver at his side. He drank slow, face unreadable, as if listening for the footsteps of fate. By morning, stories had already grown. Some swore he was a hired gun sent to hunt Pike, biding his time for the right moment. Others said he was outlaw kin, testing the town before throwing in with the gang. Still others believed he was running from law, from vengeance, from a past steeped in blood. Whichever tale was told, one truth bound them all. The drifter was not ordinary, and sooner or later, the line between his silence and his purpose would be drawn in dust and gunpowder. The day had been long and heavy with heat, the kind that pressed down until even the flies moved sluggishly in the shade. Evening was just beginning to cool the air when the saloon doors swung open, and the drifter stepped into the fading light. The street carried that quiet lull between day and night, when merchants shuttered their shops and families lit lamps against the gathering dark. His boots scuffed against the boards as he made his way to the hitching post, shoulders loose, movements unhurried. Yet something in the stillness of his posture drew eyes to him, as though every step was deliberate, measured against some rhythm only he could hear. Down the street, laughter cut sharp and mean. 3 of Pike Durgan's men came swaggering out of the blacksmith shop, saddlebags bulging with whatever they decided to take. They moved like hyenas, careless and cruel, eyes scanning for weakness. When they spotted the drifter standing alone, tightening his horse's reins, a grin passed between them. To men who survived by preying on fear, the stranger looked like easy sport. One man, quiet, a loner with no ties. "Evenin', friend," the tallest one called, voice slick with mockery. He sauntered closer, boots kicking up little puffs of dust, hand resting casual on the butt of his revolver. "Looks like you've been drinking on our street without paying the toll." The drifter didn't look up at first. He cinched the strap, tugged it once for certainty, then finally raised his head. His eyes were steady, the color of weathered steel, unblinking beneath the shadow of his hat brim. A curl of wind tugged at the dust in the street, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint creak of saddle leather. "I don't pay tolls," the drifter said, voice low even. The words hung there, not loud, but they carried weight. The bandits glanced at each other, grins widening like men who thought they'd stumbled on a joke. One of them spat into the dirt and stepped closer, his hand drifting toward his belt. "That's so. Well, maybe you pay in silver, maybe you pay in blood. Either way, Pike's cut comes first." The saloon doors creaked again. Townsfolk, curious or foolish, stepped out onto the porch to watch. A handful of faces appeared at windows, shadows pressed against glass. Everyone had seen this play out before. Durgan's men finding a victim, beating him down until his pockets turned loose. But this time, something different sharpened the air, a tension that made the onlookers hold their breath. The drifter stood motionless. His hand hung loose by his side, not near his weapon, but not far either. He seemed carved from the dusk itself, a figure too still, too calm. His eyes tracked the 3 men as they spread out in a shallow arc, boots crunching on dry earth, their laughter carrying the brittle edge of cruelty. "Last chance, stranger," the tall one sneered, thumb brushing the hammer of his Colt. "Hand it over, or we take it off your corpse." Time seemed to tighten then, every sound magnified. The squeak of a swinging sign, the distant whinny of a horse, the faint creak of the saloon porch under shifting weight. The drifter exhaled slow, a breath that steadied rather than faltered. His scarred hand twitched once, so faint it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. The tall bandit jerked his gun free, the glint of steel catching the last light. But he never cleared leather. The drifter's arm blurred, faster than the blink of an eye, the report of his revolver cracking through the street like thunder. The first man staggered back, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground, his hat spinning off into the dust. Before the other 2 could react, the drifter had already shifted, his body turning fluid, precise. 2 more shots barked out in quick succession. One man cried out as the bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him sideways. The last dropped his revolver, clutching his hand where the drifter's shot had split flesh from steel. The whole thing was over in seconds. Dust still hung in the air, the acrid smell of gunpowder curling into the evening breeze. The 3 bandits sprawled on the ground, groaning, alive but broken of their arrogance, weapons scattered beyond reach. The drifter stood exactly where he had begun, revolver lowered at his side, smoke rising faintly from the barrel. His chest rose and fell in the same calm rhythm as before, as if what had just transpired was no more troubling than tying a knot. He holstered his weapon with a smooth motion, his eyes sweeping once over the fallen men before turning toward his horse again. On the porch, silence reigned. Every soul who had gathered watched with wide eyes, their disbelief mingled with awe. They had seen men draw guns before. Many had seen men die for slower hands, but never had they witnessed such precision, such cold swiftness. The drifter had not just won. He had dismantled them. 3 seasoned predators undone before they had the chance to bare teeth. A boy at the edge of the crowd whispered, "Did you see it? He didn't even move. He just was faster." His father hushed him, though his own hands trembled where they gripped the porch rail. The blacksmith, bruised from Pike's earlier visit, stared hard at the stranger, as though trying to fit this quiet figure into the frame of a memory he could not place. The drifter said nothing. He mounted his horse in the same unhurried way he had tied the reins, swung into the saddle with practiced ease, and nudged the animal forward. The wounded bandits groaned in the dust, their blood seeping dark into the dirt, but he did not look back. His eyes fixed on the horizon, on the road that stretched away into shadows and silence. Behind him, whispers rippled through the town, like wind over dry grass. Some swore he must be a bounty hunter, the kind who lived and killed by the speed of his draw. Others whispered of outlaws who had once been lawmen, driven into exile by betrayal. A few muttered he was death itself, walking in human shape. Whatever he was no ordinary drifter. And as he rode from the saloon's glow into the desert dark, the townsfolk knew with a shiver that Pike Durgan would hear of this. A man like that, silent, steady, faster than thought, was not the kind Pike could afford to ignore. The wrong target had been chosen, and in the quiet after the gunfire, the whole town realized what that mistake would cost. The desert night stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like cold embers across the velvet dark. The drifter sat alone at the edge of the creek bed, his horse tethered nearby, the faint trickle of water the only sound between the sighs of wind. He built no fire, though the chill crept in and pressed against his bones. Fire invited questions, company, memories. He preferred the silence, though silence had a way of dragging the past out of hiding. His scarred hand rested against his revolver, but his eyes were far away, staring not at the present but into places he had buried long ago. The gunfire from earlier lingered in his ears, not for the danger of it, but for what it stirred within him. That speed, that unthinking certainty of motion, once it had been the mark of duty, of a man sworn to uphold the law. Now it was simply survival, though every time he drew, the ghosts returned. He closed his eyes, and the images came. A tin star glinting in the sun, a courthouse yard filled with townsfolk cheering his name, the sharp weight of a promise he had once carried with pride. He had been Marshal Thomas Kane then, not the nameless shadow people now whispered about. But memory did not linger on triumph. It shifted, cruel as a blade. The cheering turned to shouting. The trust of comrades turned to betrayal. He saw faces of men who had sworn loyalty. Men he had ridden beside through gun smoke and dust, the same men who one night left him bleeding in the dirt, his badge stripped from his chest. Their deal with outlaws had been struck in whispers and shadows, and when Kane refused to bend, they broke him instead. He had lived, though sometimes he wondered why, crawling into exile with nothing but his revolver and a heart full of ashes. He opened his eyes to the cold night, breath steady but heavy. The world knew him only as a drifter now, but the star he had once worn burned like a brand under his skin. Justice denied had a weight all its own, and it had bent him into the man he had become, silent, sharp, unwilling to draw unless forced, but merciless when the line was crossed. The sound of footsteps on gravel drew him from memory. He turned, hand brushing the revolver, but the figure that approached was small, hesitant. A woman in a plain shawl, lantern held low, her face pale in the glow. She stopped a few paces away, voice soft but steady. "You saved my boy earlier. Pike's men were set on him before you stepped into the street." Kane said nothing, only nodded once, as if brushing aside the weight of gratitude. But the woman lingered, eyes searching his shadowed face. "Why?" she asked at last. "You had no reason. No tie to us. Men like Pike, they've broken plenty of strangers, and most just let it be." He studied her, the lines of hardship carved into her face, the quiet strength that kept her standing when so many had bent. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "A man don't need a reason to stop wolves from tearing sheep. Wolves will keep eating till someone makes them bleed." Her eyes softened, though her expression remained wary. "Still, you fight like a man with something to prove, or something to pay for." The words stung, though he showed no flinch. Instead, he looked past her, into the black stretch of desert. "I fight only when pushed. But if I draw—" His hand flexed near the revolver, slow, deliberate. "It ends." The woman studied him a moment longer, then nodded as though she had found truth enough in his silence. She turned back toward the town, lantern light fading into the distance. Yet her words lingered, peeling open the scabs of memory once more. Cain saw his wife's face, clear as dawn. The warmth of her smile had been the only home he ever needed, the gentle touch of her hand steadying him when the world was chaos. And then he saw the night they came for her, the same men who had betrayed him, burning his home to the ground, taking from him the only light he had left. By dawn, everything was gone. They had left him alive with nothing but grief and rage, perhaps believing that was punishment enough. He rubbed at the scar on his hand, the white seam that never faded, a reminder carved deep the night he fought to hold on and failed. Every mile since then had been walked with her memory at his side. Every bullet fired weighed against the promise he once swore to her, that justice would matter, even if it meant his life. He had not kept it then, not when betrayal stole everything. But each time he raised his revolver now, it was not for glory or vengeance. It was because the world had no shortage of wolves, and someone had to bleed when they came too close. At dawn, Cain rode into the edge of town, where a rancher was mending a broken fence. The man was older, withered by sun and labor, his hands thick with callus. He looked up as Cain approached, nodding once in respect. Word spreading, the rancher said. You put 3 of Durgan's men in the dirt without so much as breaking stride. Folks are calling you a killer, some a savior. Which is it? Cain dismounted, tying his horse to the post. His gaze drifted over the broken fence, the worn tools, the endless stretch of land that needed defending. Neither, he said. I don't kill unless I have to. And Savon folks, that's too big a word for what I do. The rancher studied him, squinting against the sun. Then what do? Cain met his eyes, steady and unflinching. I finish what others start. For a moment, the rancher said nothing. Then he gave a slow nod, as though he understood more than the words themselves revealed. Well, if you're finishing things, you'll find plenty left undone out here. Pike's taken near everything we've got. Men whisper he's fixin' to make this town his own. Cain didn't answer. He simply looked out over the land, the horizon shimmering under the morning heat. In that silence, the rancher saw something, an old grief, a deeper fire, that told him the stranger was more than just a fast gun. He was a man who had carried justice once, and though it had been torn from him, it still burned in his marrow. By the time Cain mounted again, the town had begun to stir, whispers chasing him wherever he rode. Some feared him, others prayed he was their answer. But Cain knew the truth. He was neither hero nor outlaw. He was a man shaped by betrayal and loss, walking a line so thin it could snap with one wrong step. He would not seek trouble, but when it came, he would end it. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the town, Pike Durgan's name carried on the wind. Cain knew it was only a matter of time before past and present collided, and when it did, the ghosts he carried would demand reckoning. The night came heavy, smothered in silence, until the dogs began to bark at the edge of town. Lamps were quickly doused, shutters drawn tight, but fear traveled faster than fire, and soon every soul knew what was coming. Dust rolled like smoke on the horizon, torches glowing against the black sky as Pike Durgan's riders poured down the trail. Their laughter carried through the still air, a sound as cruel as it was certain, the sound of men who believed nothing in this land could stop them. Mothers pulled children close, whispering prayers as they herded them into cellars. Fathers pressed rifles into shaking hands, but knew in their bones that few bullets stood against the fury bearing down. The saloon went dark, its piano hushed, the barmaid crouched beneath a table, holding her breath. The blacksmith kissed his daughter's forehead and pushed her behind the forge, his own hammer clenched as a weapon though he knew it was no match. And in the street, between the torches and the trembling town, stood the drifter, alone. His shadow stretched long beneath the moonlight, coat brushing the dust, his hat brim low over eyes that never wavered. He had no words for the people watching from cracks in their doors. His silence was a promise, unspoken yet understood, that someone would stand when they could not. The first of Pike's men spilled into town, torches hissing as they waved them high. One was thrown against a wagon, setting it ablaze, orange flames licking into the night sky. Another torch smashed through the window of the general store, glass shattering, fire snapping at dry shelves. Chaos began to bloom, heat and shadow painting the night in wild color. Pike rode at their head, broad shoulders gleaming with sweat, a sneer curling his scarred mouth. "Bring me the man," he roared, voice echoing through the narrow street. "Bring me the fool who thinks he can cross Pike Durgan." His men fanned out, rifles gleaming, revolvers heavy at their sides. The drifter did not move. His hand rested loose above his revolver, fingers steady, his chest rising slow with each measured breath. Pike's laughter cracked the night. "There he is, a stranger who don't know when to keep riding. You picked the wrong town, friend." The drifter's voice came calm, low, cutting through the clamor. "You picked the wrong man." A ripple of unease passed through Pike's men, though none yet dared show it. Pike himself laughed louder, leaning forward in his saddle. "You think you stand for these people? They ain't worth Savon. They'll turn on you soon as I'm done with you. I've seen it before. Lawmen, heroes, they all die the same." The word struck like a spark, lawman. Whispers rushed behind shuttered doors, connecting pieces of rumor and memory. The drifter's stance, his precision, his silence, all began to form a shape long thought buried. The street held its breath. Then a pistol barked, sudden and sharp, and the reckoning began. Kane's revolver was already out, his shot splitting the night, striking the gun from a rider's hand before it cleared leather. Dust burst as hooves reared. Men shouted, the torchlight twisting into chaos. Bullets screamed, sparking against iron and wood. Windows shattered as fire spread. The blacksmith swung his hammer at a rider who came too close, the blow denting skull instead of steel. The townsfolk, driven by desperation, fired from cracks and rooftops. Their fear turned frantic courage. Kane moved like a shadow stitched to lightning, each shot precise, each motion deliberate. He stepped from firelight into shadow, reappearing with steel in his hand, cutting down those who came too near. His coat flared as he spun, revolver flashing, his scarred hand unshaking even as flames roared behind him. The air filled with gun smoke and fire, the town alive with the scream of battle. Pike's men fell, one by one, some clutching wounds, others thrown from saddles into flame. Yet Pike pressed forward, rage twisting his face, revolver drawn as he dismounted in the street. He stalked through smoke and dust, bellowing, "Face me, damn you!" Kane stepped from the haze, revolver in hand, his gaze steady on the man who had tormented the town. For the first time, his hat lifted enough to show his face clearly under the firelight, and gasps rose from those watching. Recognition spread like wildfire, even through decades of change. Marshal Thomas Kane, the name whispered in disbelief. Dead for years, betrayed by his own men, lost to time, yet here he stood, alive, carrying justice in his hand. Pike's sneer faltered, just for a breath. "Kane, no, you're dead." Kane's voice was steady, every syllable forged in fire and memory. "Not yet." The showdown narrowed. Two men locked across the dust, torches casting long shadows around them. Pike lifted his revolver, lips curling with hatred, but Kane's hand moved faster, sure, as if the years had never passed. The crack of his Colt echoed like thunder, and Pike staggered, his revolver slipping from nerveless fingers. He fell to his knees, disbelief etched across his face, before collapsing into the dirt with the dust rising to swallow him. Silence crashed down. The flames crackled, the last gunshots faded, and what remained were groans of the wounded and the faint sobs of children re-emerging from hiding. Kane stood unmoving, revolver at his side, smoke still curling from its barrel. The town stared wide-eyed, shaken not just by what they had seen, but by who had returned to them. A man thought dead, a marshal betrayed, now risen in dust and blood like judgment itself. He looked once at the bodies in the street, at Pike sprawled lifeless in the dirt, then holstered his weapon with a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes met those of the townsfolk gathering now, faces pale in the glow of dying flames. He said nothing, yet in his silence there was more than words could hold. He had come back not for glory, not for their thanks, but because wolves never stopped until someone made them bleed. The fires were doused, the wounded tended, the children carried into the safety of arms. And through it all, Cain remained in the street, his shadow long in the firelight. To the people who watched him, he was no longer a stranger. He was a legend walked back into the land, a ghost of justice returned to remind them what it meant to stand. And when the dawn finally broke, pale and gold over the scorched remains of the night, the street lay quiet. Pike Durgan's gang was no more. The town was scarred but standing. And Marshal Thomas Cain, once thought dead, now reborn in whispers, was the name on every lip.